Hi, my name is Don.
I'm Marissa.
I'm Matt.
I'm Teeny.
All right, and we're going to talk to you about the impacts of Spotify's merger with Gimlet and Anchor Media. So, to begin, imagine yourself in front of, or in charge of 270 million subscribers, and you are faced with the decision of how to reach the next big thing in the company. So in early February 2019, Spotify, Gimlet Media, and Anchor merged together because Spotify is seeking to increase their market share and growth with the podcasting industry. Next, we will hand it over to Marissa, and she will be talking about
Impact on listeners.
an impact on listeners.
So, first of all, the biggest impact of this merger would be that Spotify is now able to create original podcasts to put on their site. And so this leads to three main impacts for listeners. And that would be a larger podcast platform, because now Spotify is increasing the amount of podcasts on their site by creating new podcasts that are now original podcasts. And so that would make the podcast platform a lot larger, which would give listeners a lot more to choose from. And that is also related to a more diverse library. And so because Spotify is adding all these new podcasts, listeners are going to have more diverse versions of different genres to choose from, so they might be able to have different kinds of podcasts as well. And so that would be a more diverse library for the listeners. And then because Spotify is no longer has lower distribution costs in relation to using record labels, the subscription prices would increase at a much slower rate. So Spotify is always increasing their subscription prices to combat inflation as well as rising costs of distribution. And so these costs would rise at a slower rate, or possibly the amount that they rise by would decrease, which would impact paying subscribers, as they would pay less over a longer period of time. And so now I'm going to hand it back to Adon, who will be talking about the impacts on stockholders.
All right, so I'm going to talk about the impacts on stockholders. Thank you, Marissa. So to begin, let's just take a look at the initial impacts of the merger. So first we'll start off by looking at this graph down here, this bar chart. You can see that before the merger, Spotify was around the 141 range. Right as the merger happened and the news hit the media, and all the customers and stockholders found out about the merger, maybe there was some uncertainty about what the stock will do, so stockholders pulled out, and this actually reduced the stock price down to 137.63. But as more info and news coverage came out about this merger, the stock price went back up to 146.40. In the next 12 months, the stock price could rise as high as $215. Another impact on the stockholders is going to be the consumer behavior. The consumer behavior will allow the stock to maintain its long-term growth. Because podcast listening is habitual, and usually those who are listening to podcasts have podcast listening as a part of their daily routine, this will enable Spotify to have loyal customers who just continue to stick with that company, as well as Spotify just growing and becoming known as like the household name for podcasting. Also, they are enabling creators by allowing them to also make a profit off their podcasts, and this will bring a lot more interest from the creatives in the podcast community, because now they can directly monetize their podcasting recordings. And yeah. Next, we will hand it over to Ting Lin, and she will go over. I don't know what you're gonna go over. We'll redo it too. So.
Yeah, thank you, Idan. Now I'm talking about two stakeholders for the impact. First is the record labels. Because we know most income of record labels are from streaming music, and Spotify spent over 18% of its income to pay for the royalty fees to the record labels. But now, podcast is a new way that they can earn from the ad revenues. So Spotify will reduce the dependence of music playing. Therefore, the record labels will lose off this business, and the income will reduce from the Spotify. So next, I'll talk about the podcast creators. Cause after the merger, Spotify will try to monetize the creation of the podcast creators. So if the creations are really popular in the podcast platforms, so the Spotify will monetize the high value of their creation. Then the podcast creators will gain more from that. Even some creations from different creators have the similar topics, but they will monetize the different values. So the creators will also gain more from that. Yep, now I'll head over to Marissa and Matt to talk about impacts of competitors.
Thank you, Tinlin. So we will be talking about two different competitors in the podcast and music streaming industries. So first we will be talking about Apple, and then we will be talking about Pandora. And both of these are Spotify's main competitors in both of these industries, and they will have different roles to play during this merger.
Thank you, Marissa. All right, so the first competitor that we're talking about is Apple. Apple's had a long history with Spotify before the podcast business by competing with them in the music streaming business with groups such as iTunes or Apple Music. They've had a great deal of control over the market in general as well, given the fact that they have control over things like the hardware which the apps go on, in the form of iPhones and Apple MacBooks. They've had so much control that they've been able to enact something called an Apple tax, which is a combination of fines and fees and general inconveniences that make a product like iTunes or Apple Music, an Apple product, more appealing than Spotify. In retaliation to this, Spotify has filed an antitrust lawsuit in the European Union claiming this constitutes a monopoly. Now, the European Union is likely to find Apple guilty of this actually, because they've had similar incidents in the past with companies such as Google, who have had similar events and activities take place under their watch, and they've been fined over $200 billion in 2017. This would mean that Spotify would have a better chance to work in the music streaming business and also in the podcast business, and would be able to expand their markets not only in the United States but in Europe as well. And now we pass on to Marissa, who will talk about Pandora.
Thank you, Matt. So Pandora has been a large competitor of Spotify in both the ad-based music streaming industry as well as the podcast industry. And so Pandora actually is currently much larger than Spotify, and they have a much larger user base. However, Spotify is predicted to grow at a much faster rate than Pandora. And actually, Pandora is expected to possibly decrease in their user base over the next 5 years. And so what this means is that within about 3 or 4 years, Spotify's user base could actually meet that of Pandora or exceed it. And so that means that Pandora is a lot more likely to increase their competition by trying to attract more users. And so one way that they've already started to do this is actually by entering the podcasting industry. And so Pandora did not offer podcast services until early December of 2018 when they introduced Podcasts on Pandora, which is their podcasting platform. And so at the moment, they do not produce any original podcasts, which gives Spotify a large example in this advantage in this field. And so something that could happen in the future is that Pandora could go through a similar merger to that of Spotify's merger with Anchor and Gimlet. But all of this is purely conjecture at this point because we are not sure exactly how Pandora will react to this merger. But we just know that they will need to take steps to attract more users to their site. And so now I'm going to bring it back over to Matt, who will talk to you a little bit about our conclusion. We need to have like a slide.
Thanks again, Marissa. Usually go on that slide, I suppose.
Yeah.
Thanks again, Marissa. So, in conclusion, it's clear that the merger will have a great deal of effect on many groups. For stockholders, it'll have a positive effect as it will help increase the overall price of the stock as time goes on. For listeners, it will help create a wider variety of podcasts and music to listen to, and it will make it more available and more convenient. For competitors, it will be more difficult for them to compete with Spotify because it will be bigger, it will be more diverse, and it will also be more profitable in general and make it harder to compete. And finally, what's the final group?
I mean, you kind of went out of order. The record labels and stuff.
Record labels, perfect. Record label will do stuff too. Creators will do stuff too.
We got a whole nother round ahead of us. Take from the top.
Any questions?
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right. That was good.